The crew line up the giant Airbus for the final approach.
Landing gear down and locked. 3 green. No flaps. Only the emergency brakes. No spoilers, no reverse thrust. 4,000 feet, 195 knots. "3,000 feet, 197 knots. 2,000 feet, 200 knots.
Alert the cabin.
Cabin crew, 1 minute to landing.
Hang on.
Vertical speed at 3,000 feet per minute. We're going way too fast. And the speed's increasing, 203 knots now. It's way too fast. 1,000 feet, 201 knots.
I'm trying to get the nose up. We'll ride fast.
But even if the crew can get the Airbus on the runway, they face yet another problem. Without engines, the normal procedures for braking are severely restricted. Just a few hundred yards from the runway, the danger is far from over. The pilots manning Air Transat Flight 236 must land the plane without power and somehow get it to stop.
Everybody, I need you to brake. Hang on.
The Airbus lands hard at high speed.
The tires have blown.
Captain Piché tries to hold the nose down.
Oh my God!
After bursting 8 tires, the plane finally stops in the middle of the runway.
We saved! We made it! We made it! We made it! Come on, everybody! Get out of the plane right now! Come on, come on!
Told you we'd make it.
I just wanted to get out of this airplane quickly. I jumped, I hit the ground hard. I don't think my rear end actually even touched the chute at all.
I didn't slide down the slide. I ran down it. And they're just, get out, get out, get out. So you're just running out of this aircraft.
What in God's name just happened? I fell down to the ground, literally, and I started crying.
I mean, once you're off the plane and you're evacuated, you want to know what happened.
Piché and de Jager have flown their Airbus without power further than any passenger jet in history. Although the public story was of success, disturbing questions remain. Why had a highly sophisticated airliner run out of fuel? What exactly happened to Flight 236? Away from the cameras, an investigation begins immediately by the Portuguese, Canadian, and French transport authorities. Initial checks quickly confirmed that all the fuel tanks of the Airbus were indeed empty. But to lose more than 17 tons of fuel in such a short space of time meant they had a major leak. The question was, where? Engineers examined the fuel system, searching for faults in the tanks and the fuel lines. It wasn't long before they found what they were looking for, just behind the right engine.
In this particular case, you had a hydraulic tube that's relatively small by comparison to the larger fuel tube. And the hydraulic tube, due possibly to pulsations in the hydraulic system, were abrading against the larger tube. And eventually the larger tube had a leak in it, and the leak, or not the leak itself, but the hole eventually possibly led into a fracture of the tube, allowing this massive fuel flow outside of the engine.
Investigators begin checking into Air Transat maintenance records. They discover that 5 days before the flight, Air Transat had removed the right-hand engine for maintenance and installed a replacement unit sent by Rolls-Royce. But as they analyze the repair logs for the engine, they uncover a shocking mistake. This was not a case of faulty design, but of faulty maintenance. Rolls-Royce had supplied the engine without a hydraulic pump assembly. To overcome this, Transat mechanics had used the parts from an older engine. But it didn't fit properly, and the pipes had been rubbing together for 5 days. And then, midway over the Atlantic, one finally broke.
The engine was delivered minus these 2 tubes and a bracket. That the purpose of that bracket was to maintain adequate clearance. So if they took the bracket off the old engine and put it on the new engine, is that the pipes would be locked together so that they could possibly abrade.
As investigators question Air Transat mechanics, they find more disturbing evidence of malpractice. The chief mechanic testified that he had been concerned about the substitution of another hydraulic assembly. 5 days before the accident, he raised his concern with his superior. The company decided that the aircraft must go back into service and could not wait for the missing parts. He should go ahead with the substitution. The replacement parts only differed from the correct ones by a fraction of an inch. But it was a difference that nearly cost 306 lives. A few days after the accident, Air Transat publicly accepted responsibility for the faulty maintenance.
We have to realize that there was a mistake made in terms of changing the pump. We installed it, but then some pipes, so to speak, were needed to be connected to the pump, and there was a mismatch.
The immediate consequences for Air Transat in that event was that they got to pay a fine of $250,000, which was the highest ever in Canada, for an error that could have been prevented.
How someone that is supposed to be qualified in their job can put the wrong part onto an engine and risk 300 people's lives is beyond me.
This incident is a very strong reminder that regulation is important and safety is important, and lives will be lost in the absence of that. And they're real lives. It's not just, this imaginary figure in your head of 300 people. It's real people who suffer and continue to suffer as a result. If it hadn't been us suffering, it would have been our families.
This was by no means the end of the story. Investigators now turn their attention to the cockpit itself. What role did the crew play in the events of August 24th? Could they have done more to avert the crisis? Key questions remain unanswered. Questions about what had happened on the flight deck. The investigation into Air Transat Flight 236 discovered that basic maintenance errors had led to a fuel leak. Air Transat accepted responsibility and were heavily fined. But the focus now turns to the flight deck and the performance of the crew. What part did they play in the fuel loss?
Wing crossfeed. On.
On.
When the crew opened the crossfeed valve to transfer fuel from the left wing tank to the right, they lost 17 tons of fuel in less than 30 minutes. Yet they failed to close the crossfeed valve to prevent further loss.
We have lost both engines due to fuel starvation. We are gliding now.